The band Beach House seemingly has a signature chord that they use in a lot of their songs, and it might surprise you just how simple it is. Here it is. On its own, it doesn't really sound like much, but it's the way Beach House makes the chord function that really matters. Before we get into the video, I just want to quickly mention that all the gear I use to make these videos happen, all the way from the microphone to the editing software to the keyboard sample libraries, is all linked in the description. Anyways, in the context of their songs, this chord almost always functions as a dominant 5 chord. Now, if you don't know what that means, it might be helpful to go watch my other video about secondary dominants where I describe what dominant chords are in the first place and why they're so important in music. If you do know what a dominant chord is though, you might be thinking, this doesn't look like a dominant chord. A dominant chord should have the root, third, and fifth, and should be built from the 5th scale degree of whatever key we're in. Well, let's look at the Beach House chord and see why it's different. So, since we're in E flat major in this example, we can actually see that the chord is built from the 5th scale degree, meaning that its root is B flat. It also has the major third, D, so we can check that off the 5 chord requirement list. But we'll notice that what it doesn't have is an F, which would be the 5th that would make this a pure dominant chord. Instead, it's a G. It's interesting that Beach House does this, and if you know some amount of basic music theory, you might be inclined to simply label this as a minor 3 chord in first inversion, or a 5 chord with an added 6. Rather than some type of altered dominant chord. But I want to make the case that it's neither, and instead, this chord is actually Beach House's own signature dominant chord that fits their music much better than a traditional dominant chord. In context, it almost always sounds like there should be a 5 chord in its place. Let's take a look at their most popular song, Space Song, as an example. I'm going to play 2 short piano versions of Space Song, and the first one will use a typical 5 chord, which is what we might expect if another band was writing this, while the second one will use the Beach House 5 chord. It's subtle, but as we'll see later, it makes a difference in the mood of their music. For those who've heard the song, the difference might be a little more obvious, especially since the G on top has been a common tone through a lot of the chords in the progression. Moving to a more basic dominant chord, or even a dominant 7 chord, would leave us with either an F or an A flat on top. And I think neither of them fit the mood of the song, as well as the chord they chose to use. The reason I hesitate to label this chord as a minor 3 chord in first inversion is because that's simply not how it's functioning. Generally speaking, when we're in a major key, the minor 3 chord has a tonic function, and you can basically use it as a substitute for the major 1 chord when the major 1 chord is getting boring. Here's an example of Beach House doing exactly that with a root position minor 3 chord. The minor 3 chord has a tonic function because it shares common tones with the major 1 chord, and more importantly, the root of the minor 3 chord is only a short distance away from the root of the major 1 chord. And so making the jump from one to the other in the bass line is very unintrusive to our ears. However, when you put the minor 3 chord in first inversion, meaning you move the third to the bass instead of the root, the new bass note that you have will be the 5th scale degree of whatever key you're in. And most of the time you see this motion of 5 to 1, you could assume that the chord being played over the 5th is a dominant functioning chord rather than a tonically functioning chord. And since minor 3 chords are usually tonic functioning chords, I don't like to think of this chord as a minor 3 chord in first inversion, even though that's what it technically is. I also don't like to think of this chord as a 5 chord with an added 6, because it seems that Beach House purposefully omits the 5th when they decide to use this chord.
It can be gone. We're still right here. Finding our way. What we make it. Hardness to say. It's never as it seems. Help
This is another interesting touch because in traditional Western music theory, we're often taught that the fifth is the least important note of the chord, and we're often told that whether or not we include it in the chord doesn't matter as much as something like the third or the seventh, which are often crucial in conveying the quality and therefore sound of the chord. However, like all ideas and rules in music theory, artists have broken and bent this concept, and rock and roll guitar built entire songs around what are called power chords, which consist simply of the root and fifth with no third. Though this is the exact opposite of what Beach House is doing, it still shows that norms in music can be broken, and I think this is key for anyone who's trying to be a songwriter. Never obey the rules at the expense of a good sounding song. But beyond that, I think the reason this chord works so well with Beach House's sound is because of its relative ambiguity. Using it in a progression as a dominant functioning chord does give us a somewhat resolved sound, but since it's technically an inversion of a chord that usually functions tonically, it already kind of feels like we're home upon hearing it. It doesn't have the same tension and release as an authentic 5-7 to 1 cadence because there's no fifth and there's no seventh. This means that it's only left with one tendency tone, which is the third. A tendency tone, in the most basic sense, can just be thought of as a note that wants to go somewhere. And in a typical 5-to-1 progression, the third and fifth would both be tendency tones, though the fifth would be a weaker one. And so it makes sense that with Beach House's 5 chord, we instead only get one tendency tone, removing that weaker tendency tone that is the fifth. And the reason why we keep the third as a tendency tone is because it's really the most important one. We call it the leading tone. And the leading tone is simply the note that's a half step away from the tonic, or the 7th degree of the scale. I can't claim to know if Beach House is aware of this special chord that they've made, but they do seem to use it in a good amount of their songs. I think it gives the music a really dreamy quality and lets us focus more on the sonic texture rather than putting too much harmonic tension and release on our ears.
Shifting dreams, not what it seems it never is. No
It's unique to their sound, and they really make it work well with their style. And though the Beach House chord is a very subtle touch that doesn't stray far from musical tradition, I think all songwriters should get in the habit of experimenting with ways to make their songs not only better, but to respect the mood of their music. I love the way Beach House themselves put it when they talk about their experiences as songwriters.
All that.
Someone said about you, you're always looking to find out what the song wants. What does that mean?
Respecting the
I think
the beast, the song, like the material,
Whatever.
the
there's-
vibrations.
What the words of music in the end end up being.
Yeah, like there's an emotional color that starts to come out of something. You don't know what that is right away, but you get this feeling, and the feeling can be blank, but it's a real thing.
the goal is to never lose the feeling that made you get excited about the idea in the first place. So that's what we mean about listening to the song. So anything you do as you write, any layer you put on or bridge that you add or anything, change of a drum beat or something, anytime it leaves that feeling, then you've gone the wrong way.
As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you enjoyed it. And of course, keep making music.